Good afternoon and happy Constitution Day. Well, actually, belated Constitution Day. Constitution Day is technically September 17th. Thank you all for attending our virtual Constitution Day event with David Cole, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union and Professor of Law at Georgetown. My name is Justin Word. I'm the Director of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage and Professor of Political Science at the University of Oklahoma. I'll formally introduce David Cole in a minute, but I first want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Department of Political Science, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the law school here at Oklahoma for their generous support for our event today. And for those of you not familiar with the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage here at OU, we were founded in 2009 as an interdisciplinary center for the study of American constitutionalism, including its philosophical, historical, and legal underpinnings. Undergraduates here at OU can actually get a Bachelor's of Arts degree in constitutional studies through the letters major, or they can concentrate in constitutional studies here at OU. And we have a rich and dynamic program, 11 years old, many alumni. I encourage anybody who's in our center to go to www.iach.ou and check us out for more information. Now I'd like to formally introduce our 2020 Constitutional Day speaker, David Cole. Hi, David. Thank you for joining us. We're very lucky to have you.
I'm glad to be here.
What I want to do real quickly for everyone is introduce David, and then David and I are going to have a Q&A. I'll ask David questions, and he will give amazing answers, as he always does. And that'll be about 30-35 minutes. I encourage everyone to submit questions through the chat function, and I will moderate a Q&A period for about 20-25 minutes after David and I are done talking. So David Cole is the National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and the Honorable George J. Mitchell, Professor in Law and Public Policy at Georgetown University Law Center. He's published many books, including No Equal Justice, Race and Class in the American Criminal Justice System, and I believe most recently, Engines of Liberty, How Citizen Movements Succeed. David has litigated many cases in the Supreme Court, including Texas v. Johnson and United States versus Eichmann, which if you don't know are the flag burning cases, one against the state and one against the national government. I think most recently, Masterpiece Cake Shop, in which the ACLU represented a homosexual couple who were refused service by I believe a Boulder bakery, when they sought a cake to celebrate their wedding. Bostick versus Clayton County, which the ACLU was successful in winning, which argued that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act does in fact ban discrimination on the basis of transgender status and sexual orientation. The late, and I would say great, New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis, who famously wrote the book Gideon's Trumpet, called David, quote, one of the country's great legal voices for civil liberties today. And the late Nat Hentoff called him a one-man committee of correspondence in the tradition of Patriot Sam Adams, and I couldn't agree more. So again, welcome, David. It's great to have you. You're not physically here in Norman, but we had David out here, I think about 9 years ago, when we had a large one-day conference on habeas corpus during the War on Terror. So it's nice to have you again. So for everybody who's watching, what we're going to do is have a period of question and answer between David and I, and then we'll open it up. So I'll start with a very simple question, which is seemingly simple, I guess. How did you become the legal director of the ACLU? First of all, I'm very glad that you are the legal director of the ACLU, but how did that happen?
Thanks so much, Justin. And I wish I could be there in person. I know we all wish we could be in person for these in these times, but we do what we can thanks to Zoom. And it's great to see you virtually and to speak to your folks virtually. So, I was a law professor at Georgetown for 25 years, up until the summer of 2016. And the summer of 2016, my predecessor at the ACLU stepped down, and Anthony Romero, who was the ACLU's executive director, came down to Washington to encourage me to apply for the job. And his pitch, and you have to think back to the summer of 2016, his pitch to me was, David, you've been spending your entire career, 30 years, litigating constitutional cases, writing about constitutional law, teaching constitutional law under a conservative Supreme Court. Just think what it would be like to lead the ACLU, and particularly its Supreme Court practice, under a liberal Supreme Court. Because in the summer of 2016, if you will recall, what we all knew was that Hillary Clinton would win the election. I think Donald Trump knew that Hillary Clinton would win the election. She would then have appointed the successor to Justice Scalia's seat, which would have made the liberal justices the majority for the first time since the early 1970s. So for the first time in my career as a lawyer. And so, of course, I said, how could I not want to do that? I applied for the job. I was lucky enough to get the job, signed the contract, didn't put any what if in there, because who thought anything else could happen? And obviously on November 8th of 2016, when Donald Trump won the election, the job changed in just a dramatic way. The Supreme Court, changed in a dramatic way. And it's been a wild ride ever since. But in many respects, I'd say it's a more important job under a President Donald Trump than under a President Hillary Clinton, because the need for protection of basic civil rights and civil liberties has never been more great.
Yeah. Well, a year before you took the job, then you published Engines of Liberty. Could you talk about very generally the argument in that book?
Yeah, sure. So Engines of Liberty was really an effort on my part to kind of explain how constitutional law changes over time. And the basic argument of the book is, when we in law schools and in law classes in college and in the newspapers, when you read about constitutional law changing, the focus is on the court. The focus is on the arguments that lawyers make before the court, and the arguments that either prevail or don't prevail. And my argument in this book is that actually, when you look at how constitutional law develops, you have to look beyond the court and the lawyers before the court. And you have to look at the work of civil society organizations in a whole variety of forums, far removed from the Supreme Court, if you want to understand how constitutional law develops. And so, two of the case studies that I did in that book were marriage equality and the right to bear arms. One a liberal cause, the other a conservative cause. But both of them were, long shots when they began, real long shots. So the right to bear arms, Chief Justice Warren Burger in 1989 said that the notion that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms is one of the greatest frauds perpetrated on the American people in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. 28 years later, the Supreme Court, 18 years later, the Supreme Court recognized an individual right to bear arms in a case called Heller versus the District of Columbia. How did that happen? How did something that a Republican conservative Chief Justice of the United States called a fraud turn into a constitutional right? And the same thing with marriage equality. Marriage equality, the notion that marriage is a right for same-sex couples was unthinkable in the 1970s, unthinkable in the 1980s. I think it was inevitable when it was argued before the court in 2015. How did that happen? How did that change happen? And so what I did was I interviewed folks who were in the marriage equality movement, folks who were in the gun rights movement, and tell the story of the strategies they deployed to make this possible. And it's not about filing a case in the Supreme Court and making a clever argument and writing a good brief. It's about all the work that happens outside of that. So just, the NRA, what the NRA did was they went at it state by state by state. And they started in, the states that were most sympathetic to their rights and got individual right to bear arms provisions either into their constitutions or into their statutes or into their state judicial opinions. And they started in Florida, and then they took that to Alabama, and then they took that to Mississippi. By the time it got to the Supreme Court, they had gotten 49 of the 50 states on board with it recognizing individual right to bear arms as a state law matter. Once that's done, it's not that big a leap to federal law. And then, of course, they use the power of their organization, 5 million members, to make sure that they got people elected who respected this right and got people unelected who did not respect this right. And that made all the difference. Same thing with marriage equality. The marriage equality folks worked incrementally, just like the NRA did, to get small steps that would make it possible ultimately to get this right recognized. So they went to progressive colleges and progressive corporations and progressive cities and got them to recognize domestic benefits for gay couples. And they got progressive cities to pass anti-discrimination laws that included sexual orientation. They got pushed for family law amendments at the state level that would recognize, for example, the right of two lesbians to adopt a child together. And then only after they made that progress did they go to the courts, and they went to the state courts. They did a state strategy, just like the NRA, and they first won in Vermont, a right to civil unions. They then went to Massachusetts and got the first case recognizing constitutional right to same-sex marriage, but under state constitutions, not the federal constitution. And they built it so that by the time it did get to the US Supreme Court, there was a momentum in favor of this right. And so the idea is constitutional law, yes, it evolves through judicial interpretation, but that judicial interpretation is affected by the world around us. And an effective campaign requires a committed group of people to come together in defense of a particular value and to work incrementally over time to develop an idea that is considered outlandish at time one until it becomes inevitable at time two. And that's what both the NRA and the marriage equality movement did.
Yeah, it's a great book, and for my students who are watching now or will be watching this afterwards, David's book is a great example of what we call the Constitution outside of the courts, and it's a great example, a very accessible example of two of the most recent versions. Well, let's go back a little bit then. When you took the job, so how did the election of Donald Trump then affect your vision of what the ACLU was going to do, or what you thought needed to be done that you probably didn't think, but you thought Hillary was going to win?
Yeah. So, on the one hand, the ACLU does what it does day in and day out, administration in and administration out, with Republican administrations, Democratic administrations. We defend individual liberties and civil rights. And that's what we do. And we've been around for 100 years. This is our 100th year. Yeah. And we have sued every president in the 100 years that we've been in place. We sued Obama, we sued Clinton, we sued both Bushes, we sued Reagan, and we have sued Trump. But the scale of our activities in response to Donald Trump versus any prior president is really unprecedented. And that's because Donald Trump has taken aim at so many basic rights and liberties that we have needed to, see him in court. We took out an ad the week he was elected, we took out an ad in the Washington Post and the New York Times and said, you know, dear President-elect Trump, we'll see you in court. If you put in place some of the things you have talked about on the campaign trail that we believe are illegal, that violate constitutional rights, we'll see you in court. And so we have sued him. You know, we filed the first legal challenge to the Muslim ban.
I was just gonna say that within a few weeks of becoming president, I remember it was a Friday or Saturday night. I got a call from former students in law school, undergrad, one in particular who was at DFW Airport. He was working for a big firm in Dallas, and they were setting up card tables to try to start early versions of finding litigants who were affected by the Muslim ban.
No, that was an amazing weekend. I mean, you know, it was actually the first week of, so President Trump took office on a Monday. And on Friday, he issued the first Muslim ban. We filed the first case challenging that Muslim ban on behalf of 2 Iraqis who had been granted visas to come here because they worked closely with the US military in Iraq. And as a result, their safety was endangered.
Weren't they translators? Weren't they partly translators with the military?
Yeah, and they had worked, so because they had worked with us, it was dangerous for them to stay there. So the United States government gave them visas to come, but then the Muslim ban was an across-the-board ban. No one from Iraq could come. And so they were stuck at Kennedy Airport. We filed suit on their behalf that night. The same night, he put it in place on a Friday afternoon. They were stopped on Friday afternoon. We were in court that night, and this next night, Saturday night, the court held an emergency hearing and issued the first injunction against the Muslim ban. And it was that weekend, as you're recalling, where tens of thousands of Americans went out to airports across this country to protest this measure. And that was, I mean, to me, that was remarkable because, you know, this measure was not targeted at Americans. It was targeted at foreigners. So it wasn't our rights as Americans that were being attacked. It was somebody else's rights. And usually when the government says, hey, we're sacrificing somebody else's rights for your safety, Americans tend to say, well, okay, that's fine. Thank you for protecting my safety. But in this instance, tens of thousands of people went out to protest. And we filed the first lawsuit, and we sued him. We got the first Muslim ban struck down. We got the second Muslim ban struck down. We got the third Muslim ban struck down. That one ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, reversed and upheld that third version of the Muslim ban. But it was a significantly more narrow ban at that stage than it had been in the first 2 iterations.
Sure. Well, David, you said that the ACLU took out full-page ads in the Washington Post and the New York Times saying, we'll see you in court, Mr. President. Other than the Muslim ban, how's that been going?
So we just filed our 400th legal action against the Trump administration. 400. Just to put that in context, under George W. Bush and the war on terror, which raised a lot of civil liberties and human rights concerns, we filed 18 actions against President Bush in his first term in office, 400 against President Trump. And it's, you know, it's been remarkable. I mean, the Muslim ban ultimately was not successful, but many of our suits have been very successful. I mean, for example, family separation. The president put in place a policy that said, I want to deter people from coming to this country to apply for asylum. Even if they're eligible for asylum, I don't want people coming here to apply for asylum. So how am I going to deter them? Well, I know I will physically take their children from them and lock their children up in some unidentified location apart from the parent for the year or so that it takes to adjudicate an asylum application. I mean, you cannot imagine a more cruel policy. We challenged that policy. We ultimately were able, through that lawsuit, to identify over 2,500 families who lost their children because of this policy. And we were able to reunite the children with their families when a court ruled that this was illegal. Another of Trump's policies that we challenged was a policy that said that undocumented young women in federal custody who learn that they're pregnant and choose to exercise their right to abortion, no question they have a right to have an abortion if they so choose. The Trump administration refused to let them out of the facility in which they were held to go to the clinic to get an abortion. They would let them out to go to a dentist to get their teeth cleaned, but they wouldn't let them out to go to a clinic to get their abortion. Even in one of our clients' cases, where the reason she was pregnant and the reason she sought an abortion was because she had been raped. And so we went to court. We sued over that, and the court said, no, you have to allow them out and allow them to exercise their constitutional right. We sued President Trump over his administration's suggestion that we should put a citizenship question on the census. The census is supposed to count all people in the United States, not all citizens, but all people. And the Census Bureau said to the Trump administration, don't put a question about immigration on the census because that will lead immigrants to be scared to fill out the census. Sure. Even though census responses are anonymous and they're not, the government's not allowed to do anything with them, people nonetheless get scared, and immigrants in particular get scared, understandably. He said, no, I want to put that immigration question on the census. And we sued him over that, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and won in the Supreme Court with Chief Justice John Roberts writing the decision and saying the president put that question on there for pretextual reasons, to basically undercount areas that were Democratic and Latino, and to overcount areas that were Republican and white. And that was an impermissible justification, and therefore the census does not have a citizenship question on it. We just got another victory against President Trump on the census. Just this last week, he's now suggested that even though the census requires him to collect the actual count of people, including all people, not just citizens, he's only going to report to Congress those who are citizens and permanent residents and lawfully here, not people who are unlawfully here. But both the statute and the Constitution require a count of all people who are here, and it is used for things like seats in Congress. And so we challenged him on that, and last week a 3-judge court in New York ruled that he violated the law in proposing to do that. They are seeking an appeal to the Supreme Court. It'll be decided in the court this term. And that's just a handful of the cases that we have filed. As I said, we've filed 400 cases. And I will say, it's the NYU did a study of the sort of win-loss record of presidents. And they found that this President Trump, in cases in the federal courts, has won about 15% of his cases and lost 85%. And now the courts are not like radically left or liberal. And yet 85% of the time they're ruling against this president.
Yeah, it's I get to in a little bit. But again, in your book, you talked about, and I even characterized your book as one that we would call the Constitution outside of the courts. The ACLU, or how has the ACLU during your tenure worked in that way, outside of what we would think of the traditional legal?
Absolutely. I mean, we are, the ACLU has a litigation.
Did you hear my question, David?
Yeah. Yeah. And are you hearing me? Are you hearing me okay? Yes. Yeah. The ACLU has a litigation arm. I oversee a legal department of about 180 people who are, lawyers and paralegals who file lawsuits. But we also have a political arm. We have a communications arm. We work in coalition with all sorts of other organizations, and we have a grassroots arm. It's called People Power. We launched it actually in the wake of President Trump's election because a funny thing happened in the wake of President Trump's election. Our membership grew from 400,000 before President Trump was elected, which is already, we're the largest civil liberties organization in the country, to 1.8 million members within about 6 months of President Trump getting elected. And I think that's actually a sign of the health of our civil society, that people, when they feel threatened, they don't just sit back. They don't just say, oh me, oh my, there's nothing I can do. They come forward and they join organizations that they think are going to defend their rights and values. So, it works both ways. When President Obama was elected, the NRA gained tremendous support because people were concerned that their right to bear arms would be under attack, and so they upped their support or joined the NRA. And the same thing happened with us with President Trump. So, but we had all these new people who came to us and they said, I want to be a member, but I want to also take action. I don't just want to write a check and get a card. I want to actually do something. So we created something called People Power, which encourages individual citizens in their local, environments to come together with like-minded folks and engage in action in the real world to advance civil liberties and civil rights. And sometimes we suggest campaigns like right now, it's all about getting out the vote and making sure that people have a way to vote safely in the pandemic. And we encourage folks to, urge their election officials to do everything they can to make sure that people have a way to vote safely. We've also had campaigns around local officials adopting immigrant-friendly law enforcement policies, because when you're a police officer in a town and there are immigrants as well as citizens within your town, you want the immigrants to trust you as much as the citizens. You want them to be able to call you if they see a crime happening or if they're the victim of a crime. But if they believe that when they call you, you're just going to turn them over to ICE, they're not going to call, and you're not going to. So many local law enforcement chiefs have adopted policies that said, we're going to leave the enforcement of immigration law to the federal government. We're not going to do it because it undermines our ability to keep our people safe. So we would, we encourage people to do that, but also we encourage people to take on whatever, the issue is in their, in their community that's a civil liberties or civil rights issue. But the main thing is to come together, to be a guardian of liberty, to act in the real world to defend liberty. And that program, which started with 0 members when we launched it in 2017, has now over 500,000 people who have identified as people power activists, who have engaged in concrete action in the real world to advance or defend civil liberties, and have reported it back to us. And it's remarkable. I mean, that's a remarkable thing, because at the end of the day, the kind of the strength of liberty, the strength of constitutional rights turns on us. It turns on people getting involved, exercising their own constitutional rights to get involved, to associate with like-minded people, to advocate for what they believe in. And if we do that, we'll be okay. We'll be okay whether, we have a president who we don't like on the right or a president we don't like on the left. Our civil rights and our civil liberties will be protected. But if we don't step forward, come together, and engage in that kind of concerted action to defend liberty, to defend civil rights, these are just paper rights. And lots of countries have this is a Constitution Day talk, right? Every country has a constitution, basically. They all look pretty darn good, but few countries have the kind of robust rights protections that we have. And that is because of us. It's because of citizens coming together in organizations that fight for their rights, whether it's your Second Amendment rights, whether it's your First Amendment rights, whether it's your equal protection rights. You got to do that, and I think Americans understand that. I think we've seen that in the response to this president. We've seen it in the protests on the streets around police abuse. We've seen it in the March for Our Lives campaign that high school students put together after the Parkland shooting. We saw it in the Women's March. We have seen it time and again, people recognizing that to defend your rights, you've got to stand together, you got to stand up, and you've got to engage.
Well, just to that point, a little more concretely, could you talk about what you think are the biggest challenges to civil rights or civil liberties right now?
So that's a great question. I think there are, I would say, under this administration, at the federal level, immigrants' rights has been it has been the central issue. President Trump has decided that scapegoating immigrants is a good political tool, and he has done it. And he is, to the point of separating families. And that's just one of a host of measures that he's put in place, illegal measures that courts have enjoined, that were designed basically to deport immigrants or stop immigrants from coming, to deny immigrants basic due process rights. But that's at the federal level. At the state level, I would say reproductive freedom. Not in every state, but in many states, there's a sort of a concerted attack on women's ability to control when and whether they have children. And President Trump promised to get Roe versus Wade overturned, and that has sort of ginned up an effort within the states to enact harsher and harsher bans on abortion. And then I would say criminal justice. And criminal justice, this is not a new one. And this is not a Trump one. And this is not a liberal conservative one. I mean, the mass incarceration system, the criminal justice system in this country is so out of control that there is a bipartisan consensus, left-right consensus, that it's gotten out of control and we need to cut it back. And, Oklahoma, in 2016, Oklahoma went for President Trump with a bigger margin than I think every state but one in the country. But at the same time, they enacted ballot measures that reduced penalties for low-level crimes and drug offenses.
Yep.
And that was because there's a bipartisan consensus. We are working in a coalition that is supported by the Koch brothers on the right and George Soros on the left. Yeah. There's no other issue on which there's that kind of agreement. And so, you look at the streets, look at the protest after the George Floyd, murder in Minneapolis. This is a problem that we need to deal with, and we need to deal with right away. And it is, I'm hopeful that these protests and this bipartisan consensus will in fact lead us to significant reforms that both reform policing, but also reduce the size of our criminal justice system. I think that's one of the greatest civil rights issues of our generation.
Yeah. Well, I kind of want to shift a little bit. In this month's New York Review of Books, you have a great article trying to explain the Supreme Court's most recent term. And it needed some explanation for the lay reader, because the court, particularly the Chief Justice, who's been doing this for a while anyway, in many people's minds seemed to vote against his party, if you will. And we had some unexpected outcomes on LGBTQ, the Title VII and 1964 Civil Rights Act, and other cases. Could you talk a little bit about how you understand why the court is voting the way it is, not only in this most recent term, but more generally.
Yeah. So, yeah, it was a very surprising term. I mean, the sort of liberal cause won on abortion, on LGBT equality, on DACA, the Trump effort to take away protection from 700,000 young people who came here through no fault of their own and were given protection by the Obama administration, and on Trump's tax records. And it wasn't only Chief Justice Roberts, it was Chief Justice Roberts in the majority on all those cases, but Justice Gorsuch wrote the opinion in the LGBT equality case that I argued. And in the Trump tax records cases, the vote was 7-2, and Chief Justice Roberts was joined by the two justices who Trump appointed, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, joined the liberals in rejecting President Trump's argument that he's above the law and he doesn't have to respond to subpoenas for his tax record. So, so why did that happen? I think a lot of conservatives thought, well, now we finally got a solidly conservative court, 2 Trump appointees, 5 strong Republican appointed conservative justices, and a lot of blockbuster cases. We're going to win them. And they didn't. So, I think a number of things explain it. One is that in each of those cases where, our side, the side the ACLU was on, prevailed, we made arguments that appealed to conservative values, conservative principles, textualism. Reading statutes, as they are written. That was the argument that won in the LGBT equality. Stare decisis, holding fast to what we have done in the past. That was the argument that won in abortion. The rule of law, the notion that no one stands above the law, that was the argument that won in the Trump tax records cases. And so it was partly that, and DACA, the Trump effort to take away this protection from 700,000 immigrants, the principal problem that Chief Justice Roberts identified was that the Trump administration gave no consideration whatsoever to the settled expectations of these 700,000 people who have gone to school, taken jobs, gotten married, developed lives, bought homes. Those settled expectations, that's a conservative value, right? So in some respects, we were able to prevail by appealing across the aisle to a conservative value. And, I think also the fact that there was strong popular support for the side that came out in each of these cases. If you poll people on whether the DACA recipients, the Dreamers, should be deported, something like 75% of Republicans think they shouldn't be deported, and 80% of Democrats think they shouldn't be deported. So it's a very popular group. The notion that the president should not be above the law, that's a fairly popular idea. And the notion that people should be judged at work on the basis of their job performance and not on the basis of who they love or what gender identity they have is widely supported. And so you had work, and that's because there was work done outside the courts, going back to Engines of Liberty, over many years to develop these principles. And I think the court doesn't act in a vacuum. It doesn't sort of put its finger up and figure out which way the political winds are blowing and just go that way. But it is affected by the political climate. So we appealed to conservative arguments. We had popular support for many of these ideas. And then finally, I'd say, at the end of the day, the Supreme Court's legitimacy rests on it not being a partisan division institution. Congress can be divided along partisan lines, always has been, always will be. The president is going to be a Democrat or a Republican, no matter what, right? But the court is supposed to rise above that. And so had the court taken all these blockbuster cases and voted in every case 5 Republicans against 4 Democrats, people would say, why do we give these people this kind of power? Why do we give these people life appointments? So I think there's a recognition, certainly by Chief Justice Roberts, but I think also by a number of the other justices, that it's important that the court decide cases based on law, that they not be divided along partisan lines. And I think that encourages a kind of open-mindedness and a receptivity to argument, which I wish we saw in the rest of our, in the rest of our polity and the rest of our government, because it sure is refreshing when decisions are not made solely along party lines.
Sure. Well, I'm seeing some interesting questions here, and I'm going to get to them, and a lot of them are perfectly suited to what you've been talking about already. I just have one last kind of formal question for you as the legal director of the ACLU. In its 100 years, the ACLU certainly has taken a lot of controversial cases, right? Nazis marching in Skokie, Illinois, you name it, defending alt-right protesters in Charlottesville. How does the ACLU see their role, at least in terms of representing extremely controversial and divisive figures?
Yeah. So, I think our view is that the Constitution protects all of us. And that means all of us. It doesn't just protect the people we like. It doesn't just protect the people whose views and opinions we share. It protects all of us. And it is important to protect those rights universally across the board. Because going back to what I was saying before, the strength of liberty, the strength of rights depends on essentially people believing in those rights. And if the rights are seen as universal, well, then everybody has an interest in preserving those rights. If the rights are seen as protecting only those who are popular, or only those who are, with it, or only those who are conservative, or only those who are liberal, then why would you support those rights if you're not, already in that camp? And to me, the place where we do the most work of this time is precisely on the First Amendment, the right to speak. And the First Amendment is the amendment that protects all the activity that we've been talking about this afternoon. It's the right to speak out when you don't like something the government's doing. It's the right to associate with others in civil society groups to defend the values you believe in. It's the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. It's the right to assemble, to protest in the streets. It's the right of the press to report on government abuse. That is, I think, the core of our constitutional system. And we've got to insist that right belongs to all of us.
Yeah. And for my students who've had me before and soon will, what David's talking about is Palco versus Connecticut. This is what order of liberty means. The test would be, if something's going to be incorporated, imagine this right going away with the entire system fall apart. These are the rights that he's talking about, a kind of master right.
Exactly.
Let me ask you some questions from some of our guests, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
One to a point you were just talking about when we were talking about the court's most recent term. Let me, Dan Jensen wants to know about what your opinion is at all, either from the ACLU or you personally, on term limits for Supreme Court justices.
So, I think it's a good idea. It would have been a good idea if it was put in place originally. I don't think, I think the idea of life tenure is to provide independence so that people don't have to worry about their next job. They don't have to worry about getting reelected. They can be independent. They don't, and that is a critically important value. But I think a substantial term would serve the same function. Some people have suggested 18-year terms starting every 2 years, and that would mean that every justice would every president would get to appoint 2 justices, and and 18 years is long enough, is the idea. I think that's a good idea. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's, that there's going to be a constitutional amendment, which is what it would require to put that in place. And so, I'm not optimistic about the structure of the Supreme Court changing anytime soon.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, well, couldn't get any more topical than this. Jody King wants to know if you have an opinion on Trump banning TikTok. By the way, Trump is not suggesting we ban TikTok. He's using the Commerce Department to ban further downloads of updated versions of TikTok. But if you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's problematic for the government to be essentially denying people a forum for expression. It is a forum for expression, and to sort of take it away does raise serious free expression, First Amendment concerns.
Yeah. Somebody wants to know what you think about the fallout, or for lack of a better term, of probably the case that's going to spur the most amount of litigation, in my opinion, McGirt versus Oklahoma.
Really interesting case. I mean, that's one I didn't mention, but it was also a surprise, right? And it was also a 5-4 decision in which a conservative departed from his
Gorsuch again.
brethren, in this instance, Gorsuch. Yeah. And, I mean, the immediate implications, of course, are for certain individuals who are right now sitting in jail.
As a retroactive, yeah.
Right, because they were prosecuted by the state when they shouldn't have been prosecuted by the state. My understanding is that that's not a massive, it's not likely to be a massive number, but I don't know the precise number. But there's this sort of broader question, which is what are the implications of the underlying determination, which is that half of Oklahoma is actually Native American land, and at oral argument in the case, the state was arguing that it would have massive, Oklahoma was arguing it would have massive implications and would be very disruptive to recognize that there's Native American sovereignty over this half of the state. The lawyers for the defendant, for the individual, were saying, oh no, it won't have any of those implications. It's very narrowly tailored to this particular criminal question. My guess is that the state has shifted its view and probably now is saying, oh no, it doesn't actually have broad implications, whereas other private litigants have shifted their views and said it has very, very broad implications. And only time will tell, but I'm sure it will generate a substantial work for lawyers in Oklahoma for the next decade trying to figure it out.
Yeah. We have a question here from Marianne Burdett. She wants to know what you think about qualified immunity, and I would assume she means qualified immunity for state officials, particularly police officers. That's what I'm guessing.
Yeah. So I actually wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal last weekend about qualified immunity and about the problems with the doctrine. This is a doctrine that basically says that if a police officer violates your constitutional rights, or any government official violates your constitutional rights, and you can establish that he violated your constitutional rights, you cannot receive any compensation for that injury unless you can also show that no reasonable officer would have thought that the action was legal. And that is the courts have read that as a very, very high bar. And so many, many, many constitutional violations as a result go wholly unredressed.
Mm-hmm.
We at the ACLU have been engaged in a campaign to reform qualified immunity in a bipartisan, it's a bipartisan effort with folks from the Institute for Justice and the Cato Institute, which are on the right, but find this to be a very problematic doctrine. And I think there's some chance that it will be reformed. Justice it has been criticized very, very strongly by Justice Sotomayor and Justice Clarence Thomas. There aren't many things that Justice Thomas and Justice Sotomayor agree on.
Yeah.
And they don't, it's not the same reason. I mean, Justice Thomas thinks the doctrine is unmoored. It is not found in the Constitution.
In the
It
text,
is not found in any statute. The judges just made it up, and so he thinks it's invalid. Justice Sotomayor thinks it's problematic because of its effects, because it basically says to police officers, you're not going to be held accountable even if you violate somebody's sacred constitutional rights.
Sure. The great question here, a little broad, but I think it's important. If the case came up, could an argument be made that access to high-speed broadband is a fundamental right, and Congress should provide it, or pass legislation to provide, I guess, internet for all?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would certainly support, internet access for all, broadband for all. It's the kind of thing where, what makes it difficult as a constitutional argument is that the Constitution generally provides us with negative rights, rights to be free of government intruding on our ability to speak. Whereas when you're talking about access for everybody to broadband, you're asking for affirmative support to exercise a right. And generally speaking, the Constitution, has generally not been read to support those kinds of rights. But if the people, us, right, believe that access to broadband, access to the internet is critical to being an engaged citizen, to having a functioning democracy, to ensuring that everybody is equally situated in respect of those questions, we can demand that be provided through the legislature.
Sure.
And we should.
We only have a few minutes left, but one more question here, which is a perfect way to kind of end the Q&A period here. Where do you see us going in terms of civil liberties if Trump wins? I can imagine it's going to be much of the same, but if Biden wins too, so also I should say.
Yeah. So, I think, November 3rd is probably the single most important date for civil liberties and civil rights, in the past decade. And much, it's just, in many respects, the world will change. The world of civil rights and civil liberties will change, depending on who wins election on that date. The ACLU is a nonpartisan organization, and we don't endorse or oppose candidates for elective office, including for the presidency. But we do encourage people to vote, to exercise the franchise, and to vote like your rights depend on it. And what that means is learn about the candidates, learn about the positions they take, and vote for those candidates whose views, encompass a robust understanding of civil rights and civil liberties. Frankly, what we have seen from President Trump is not a robust understanding of civil rights and civil liberties, sad to say. And 4 more years would mean that the ACLU would be very, very busy. We would continue to be filing hundreds of lawsuits to try simply to hold the line on civil rights and civil liberties. If Joe Biden wins the presidency, we'll be suing President Biden too. I can guarantee.
Oh, I know you will.
But I think, it won't be 400. I don't think it will be 400 suits. And I think you'd probably have an administration that is going to be more amenable to recognizing basic rights of citizens across the board.
Sure. There are a few minutes left, and I just got another question, which I think is absolutely perfect for you in the ACLU. What are your thoughts? I can only imagine that I could probably answer almost verbatim for you. But the Trump administration's threat to to withhold Department of Education money to states that teach 1619, that sort of thing, who in a sense teach un-American versions of American history.
You know, I don't think the federal government should be dictating the curricula of local schools. One of the great things about our system is that it's a federalist system, and it's a system of divided power, and divided power is less dangerous than unified power. And particularly in the area of education, where we have official government entities, public schools, teaching our children, inculcating our children in what it means to be a citizen, it is important that that be a locally based, distributed enterprise, not, dictated from Washington. And so it's outrageous that he is seeking to, withhold funds from schools that want to educate people about our own history, just because that's a dark part of our history. We have to confront all of our history, the dark parts and the light parts, the good moments, the great moments, and the sad moments, the tragic moments. And I think we're strong enough to do that. President Trump, I guess, doesn't think we're strong enough to do that. I think we are.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question and great answer to end today on. Again, thank you so much, David, for taking time out of your busy day to be with us. And thanks to all of you who registered. Again, thanks to the Department of Political Science, College of Law, and College of Arts and Sciences and our donors, both named and anonymous, for continuing to support the IACH and the programming and the educational mission that we're all about. So thanks again. Happy belated Constitution Day. And thanks again, David. Good luck. And I hope I talk to you soon.
Yeah, great to be with you. Bye-bye.